Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with so many of you here in person. My name is Rachel Bovard, and I'm joined today by Matt Purple, Dan Caldwell, and John Glaser, and we're going to jump right into it. Something we didn't hear a lot about in the campaign that to some extent I feel is still ongoing a little bit is about each candidate's foreign policy. And it's a real shame, I think, particularly because the Trump administration has been so active on a lot of foreign policy areas, and also inactive in the sense that they didn't really take us to any new wars. But at the same time, they were also the administration that hired John Bolton. So there is a lot to unpack about what the Trump foreign policy is, what it could be. And I think today we also want to talk about what a Biden foreign policy could look like as well. So before we get into the specifics, though, I did want to kind of pose the question to all of you. Foreign policy, when it comes to elections, is notoriously not a huge base motivator and turnout to the polls. But I wanted to get your thoughts on what role Trump has played in this realignment that's taking place on the right. And specific to his foreign policy, how is that shaping the sort of new base of the Republican Party? So if we can just go down the line and each of you sort of speculate on that front.
Yeah, I mean, it can be a bit hard. Can everybody hear me? Okay, there's my mic. It can be a bit hard to tell because there was so little discussion of it during the campaign, right? We had that third foreign policy debate that wasn't actually a foreign policy debate. They seemed to talk about everything except foreign policy. There really wasn't much input on that subject, and understandably so in some ways, because we're facing immense domestic tensions right now. There's a culture war going on. We're trying to figure out, kind of grappling around, trying to figure out who we are as a people. So I understand that foreign policy has been put on the back burner, but it's still a vitally important issue given, how much power, especially the modern executive, has over it. And I think we were really done a disservice by this campaign. I think the lack of discussion about how a president would handle international affairs was really unfortunate. And, to your question about Donald Trump achieving some kind of realignment, I think he's moved the ball in the right direction, albeit not as much as we would like it to go. Right? I think that the beginnings of the troop pullouts from Afghanistan and Germany are certainly encouraging. But on the other hand, you have the continuation of the hideous war in Yemen, which he's prosecuted with even more zeal than Barack Obama did. You had the assassination of Soleimani in Iraq. You had the pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal, which was a vitally important piece of diplomacy, I think. So really kind of a mixed record all around. And the question is, once you kind of distill that down to politics, is he moving the politics in the right direction? Because the polls all show that big majorities of voters are tired of these wars. They want out of them. Is he finally getting the DC crowd to kind of match public opinion? And I think a little bit, but it really shows just the extent to which foreign policy change in DC, given the current climate, is accomplished in baby steps rather than serious, meaningful change.
I think that if there's something that the president deserves a lot of credit for, is that he has shattered the foreign policy consensus within the Republican Party. And regardless of how the election ultimately turns out, I personally, looking at some of the numbers, believe that it is likely that there is going to be a Biden presidency. But if something does change and there is a Trump presidency, I think under either scenario, there is going to be a larger battle within the Republican Party about what Republicans truly believe around foreign policy. And I think that the president has created an opportunity to make realism and restraint the dominant foreign policy within the Republican Party. That's not because he's had a perfect foreign policy record. It's not because he's done everything right around foreign policy. It's primarily due to his rhetoric, and also due to the fact that, as Congressman Davidson was alluding to earlier, in many ways prominent neoconservatives and the infrastructure that supports them has been driven out of the Republican Party. People like Bill Kristol, a lot of the people around John Bolton, they are no longer influential within the Republican Party. And that creates a space for those of us who believe in a more realist and restrained foreign policy to come in and really reshape the thinking of a lot of members of Congress. So you have more people like Congressman Warren Davidson and less people like Congresswoman Cheney. And there was an interesting piece in Politico a couple weeks ago, or actually a few days ago. I mean, days seem like months since the pandemic, but it was a profile of Liz Cheney, and I think a lot of people focused on the headline that was comparing her to Margaret Thatcher. But if you actually read the piece, I don't think it was very good for her, because about the only people who are on the record saying positive things about her were people associated with entities like the Lincoln Project and Republican Voters Against Trump. And I think that just showed that a lot of folks that are incredibly unpopular with the Republican base, who are out of step with them, are really supporting people like Liz Cheney, where I think the base is more with people like Congressman Warren Davidson, Congressman Matt Gaetz, Senator Rand Paul, and of course President Trump. So that's the biggest opportunity that I've seen President Trump create. I think on things like, on policy-wise, and things like Afghanistan, he deserves a lot of credit, making that the most popular position with the Republican Party. I think that he does deserve credit on things like Syria, although it's disappointing he didn't go all the way. And then, of course, a lot of his personnel choices. But the long-term opportunity, I think, is what we should be excited about. And I think that the foreign policy debate in the Republican Party, in some ways, might be more intense than the debate over economic policy. So it's going to be something to watch, and that's because of what President Trump has done over the last 4 years.
You know, you're not going to hear me claim that I have my finger on the pulse of the voting public. I tend not to. But my understanding is that, in general, foreign policy is a very low priority for voters. Voters tend to vote by party and by ideology. And then after that, their pocketbook and certain single issues that they very much prioritize. National security just tends to be a pretty low priority for voters. Occasionally in elections, like in 2004, for example, people will say this is a national security election, you know, that was really important. And that's probably, it has some validity, but even there it's probably a little less than people say. And in 2008, you know, it was a factor that Obama contrasted himself with his fellow Democratic candidates by saying he was initially against the Iraq War. So they tend to have possibly an effect, but people vote by reference to heuristics and ideas and not so much by foreign policy. And, you know, certainly it's the case, I think, that Republican voters and supporters of the president have adopted some of his sloganeering about ending endless wars. But really, I think what you're seeing is an overall trend that is actually generational and will probably continue against the idea of the United States as being the one nation in the world that has to enforce global order and fight the enemies of progress, and has to take a leadership role and have military predominance and engage in all these wars. There's some public fatigue in from the post-Cold War and post-9/11 years. And that's going to impact both Democratic and Republican politics going forward. If it's true that the Biden administration is incoming, you know, they will feel those same kinds of pressures that the Trump administration has felt to roll back and engage in a more restraint-oriented approach to the world. The problem is, I think, that the foreign policy that the public is kind of sick of continues behind closed doors. Meanwhile, politicians use these slogans to convince them that they're doing the peaceful thing and the restraint-oriented thing and the realist thing. And indeed, we're still seeing lots of problems. The drone war has expanded under Trump, and the rules of engagement have been loosened. But you don't really hear much about that because it's done largely in secret. You know, Libya continues to be an arena for middling powers to compete in very nasty ways. We're enabling that. We're engaged in, you know, we've increased troops in the Middle East, peppered throughout bases, and we're stuck in a morass in Syria and in Iraq, partly because of our focus on Iran, right? So all this stuff continues. And yet people give credit to Trump and others for pursuing some kind of alternative. And so I think we need an informed public to be able to complete that kind of shift.
So, John, something you just mentioned about sort of Biden's going to inherit this sort of generational fatigue and I think a little bit more awareness of America's role in the world is not, a policeman by default. So what does that look like in a Biden administration then? Because you have a potential Biden administration coming in with a legacy of an Obama-Biden administration that wasn't necessarily reflecting what you just said of the preferences of the public. So where do you all see sort of the fault lines going into a potential Biden administration? Will they continue certain Trump legacies, or will they sort of pick up where Obama left off? You want to go down?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think that one of the greatest developments in politics today is the changing of the left from something that was fairly staunchly anti-war during, my high school years. I mean, the Iraq War, they were, really staunch about that, and at least in some cases, not the Democrats in Congress necessarily, but we had really good work going on at, magazines like The Nation and so on. There was a real genuine anti-war sentiment on the left, and that still exists. That still has a heartbeat, I would say, in certain quarters, but it's been largely overtaken by a real sense of hysteria over Russia. And the association of Trump with Russia, I think, has fundamentally changed the left in that way. And Biden reflects this to a certain extent. He wrote an article for Foreign Affairs back in the spring where he almost sounded like he wanted to fight another Cold War. He put us at kind of the head of the democracies table, and then he had this other table over here where Russia was sitting, North Korea was sitting, it was basically an axis of Trump, right? It was like a Trumpistan table, and we were expected to counter this. This was the new dividing line in the world, and I mean, it was essentially a Cold War in name only. And Biden was talking about, wielding the torch of, freedom and all this rhetoric that we've heard thrown around so often. I don't know how much pressure he's going to be under from the left once Trump is gone to actually follow through on a foreign policy that will resemble that. I do think that the sentiment, the animus against Russia is so strong in his party right now that he's probably going to feel something. And Biden he's been inconsistent on foreign policy. He's certainly not a consistent dove by any stretch of the imagination. I think that he could fall victim to that pretty easily. And then, look, he has said, in contradistinction to people like Bernie Sanders and his party, that he does want to leave a troop contingent in the Middle East. He's come out as more kind of hawkish in that way as well. He's not the worst liberal internationalist that you're going to find in the Democratic Party, but he could bring some of the worst liberal internationalists that you're going to find in the Democratic Party into his State Department, into his Defense Department. We've all seen the names, Susan Rice and so on, Samantha Power. So it is a question mark right now, but it is not a question mark that I'm particularly optimistic about. And I would encourage you, I'm sure most of you have read that Foreign Affairs article, but it's a very interesting glimpse into, I think, his thinking and the thinking of the left right now.
I agree with a lot of what Matt said, and that's why I'm very concerned about what our foreign policy would look like under a Biden administration. I have to be honest, I hope I'm wrong about this. I hope that in 6 months, a lot of you are emailing me and saying, hey, Dan, you were completely wrong at the TAC conference. You're a moron and shouldn't speak about foreign policy again. I mean that. I think it's better for our country if we pursue a more restrained foreign policy, but based on what we've seen Biden say and do in the past, I don't think there's a lot of hope, with one kind of silver lining that I'll get to in a second. So there was this kind of myth that developed during the campaign that Biden was the closet restrainer in the Obama administration. It was based off a couple things: his supposed opposition to the Obama surge in Afghanistan and his supposed opposition to the intervention in Libya. But I think if you go back and check the actual record of what he was saying and doing at that time, the reality is that the narrative that he tried to paint during the campaign isn't exactly true. While he didn't support the full Obama surge into Afghanistan, he supported a surge of counterterrorism forces into Afghanistan that he called the CT Plus plan. And I can tell you that would have been extremely violent. There would have been higher American casualties. Counterterrorism forces are like Delta Force, Naval Development Group, SEAL Team 6. They go in, they kick doors, they do raids. Those are extremely violent. They're dangerous for American troops. They increase civilian casualties, and it would have enmeshed us further in the quagmire in Afghanistan with maybe just a slight less degree of American casualties in the full Obama surge. In regards to Libya, if you go back and look at press clippings from the 2012 campaign, he was running around states like New Hampshire saying NATO got it right. Sounding a lot like Hillary Clinton, who was touting the death of Muammar Gaddafi. He only really started to say he opposed the intervention in Libya when it appeared he might challenge Hillary Clinton in the 2016 Democrat primary. In addition, look at his record as senator. He was a key proponent of the Iraq War. He was Senate Foreign Relations Chair. He could have helped slow the march to war, but he helped shepherd through the 2002 AUMF. He has, as Matt pointed out, during the campaign, he has made clear himself in an interview with Stars and Stripes and then his advisors in interviews with other publications that he wants to leave troops in Afghanistan, Syria, and Iraq to do counterterrorism missions. People like Susan Rice have criticized the negotiations in Doha, which have set us on a path to full withdrawal from Afghanistan. He's been critical of the diplomatic approach that Trump has taken in North Korea, which, while imperfect, is a better alternative to war, and I think better than the policies that were pursued under the Obama administration. The one thing that could possibly change my mind about this is in the coming weeks is when we start to see some personnel announcements. If you see people like Bill Burns being mentioned as Secretary of State as opposed to Susan Rice, I think that's a good sign. If somebody like Matt Duss, who is a foreign policy advisor for Senator Sanders, is put in a prominent position instead of shoved in, say, an office for something like refugees and other progressive restrainers, they're given prominent roles in administration. I think that is a good sign, and in many ways is a result of some of the political incentives that John was alluding to, that people are starting to see around foreign policy. Foreign policy is, as John said, it's not a top issue for voters, but our elections are decided increasingly by small margins. So small groups in key states can swing an election. And as we saw in 2016, I'm sure many of you have seen the research by Professors Kreiner and Shin that showed that the key thing that drove Obama voters to Trump in the 2016 election in counties that flipped in Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania was higher levels of what they term military sacrifice, so higher levels of wounded in action, killed in action, and deployments. And that was probably key to Trump's victory. And the Biden campaign saw that political data, and that's why they leaned in on this dovish image of Biden, because there was political advantage in that. So if he's going to look at the political incentives of that, I think that might restrain some of his worst tendencies. In addition to better personnel appointments, that would give me a little more hope that things will be better. But right now, I'm very pessimistic about what our foreign policy would look like under Biden.
You know, I think about this in a very big picture kind of way. So I think the United States has had a pretty consistent grand strategy that has guided its foreign policy, which is a narrower concept, for many decades, since the Second World War. That grand strategy was expanded after the end of the Cold War, right? And what this means is that there's remarkable continuity in the character and the drives and the strategy that we have pursued over these years. And I think if you consider the last few administrations, say Obama and Trump, I think reasonably speaking, you could say that the president in both of those cases was disinclined in some cases to carry the burdens of global leadership that demands that the United States play this outsized role in the world. And what we saw was that even a president disinclined to carry the burdens of that global leadership will not readily shirk them, because it's very hard to turn that ship of state. What we're talking about is a massive military-industrial complex, a massive national security state, a massive bureaucracy, and a political consensus at the top, which is withering away at the grassroots, admittedly, but a political consensus remains at the top that the United States plays this role in the world. And so foreign policies may change. Definitely the character of American foreign policy is going to change from Trump to Biden. You know, our approach and our posture towards specific states, the way we carry out diplomacy, all those things will change. But will it be the case that we will no longer have you know, something like 800 military bases in 70 or 80 countries around the world? You know, will we decide to start to pull back the permanent forward deployed posture that we have of 250 to 300,000 troops posted overseas? Will we start to stop wasting almost $1 trillion on our national security every year? You know, those are the questions that actually, I think, indicate some fundamental changes ahead. And Biden is certainly not someone who has an impassioned direction to alter American foreign policy. If he's going to be stasis, and if he's going to be status quo, and if he's going to be relatively conventional, which we know he is because he has a long track record, I suspect the policy inertia that has characterized American foreign policy for so many decades will continue, despite the political pressures that we're all talking about.
So I want to pull on a thread, Dan, that you raised in your initial response to the first question, which is that Trump has sort of blown open this opportunity to reshape foreign policy on the right. And we talk about this most frequently in the executive branch for good reason. But Congress also has a role, and Congress has been reshaped on this issue, particularly in the spending that John just mentioned, and sort of our implementation. Congress has a lot of authority that they sometimes choose not to exercise. So I'm wondering if you can each discuss sort of the role of Congress going forward in, potentially a Trump administration, potentially a Biden administration. One may be divided government. What should restrainers and realists expect from Congress going forward?
Not very much, because it's Congress, and because we've all become accustomed to this by this point.
This can be aspirational, by the way.
Yes,
this can be an aspirational
this is like
answer.
idealistically aspirational. This is climb the mountain, but look, and that's not to say that Congressman Warren Davidson, Rand Paul, and others haven't tried to implement change. They absolutely have. The problem is it usually gets shot down by roughly a 2/3 margin. The problem is there just isn't enough energy there right now, and the problem is not just ideological. It's not that just that they don't agree with us per se on realism and restraint. It's also that Congress has abdicated so many of its core responsibilities, the power of declaring war, the power of the purse. These things are not wielded in the way that they used to be. It's all just kind of signed over to the executive with a blank check because Congress doesn't want to deal with it. And this gets into, I think, an even broader, more systemic problem that we have to confront too, and that is that they don't always have to deal with it. We are transitioning into an era where war is increasingly becoming invisible and unfelt. We're increasingly using drones to prosecute our wars. We're increasingly, the amount of manpower that's being used and required is much more minimal. The bloodshed on our part is much more minimal. And we're doing it all with borrowed money. So we're not having to raise taxes in order to fund these campaigns. If you can make it invisible, then you can take it off the table for voters. And you can make sure that congressmen aren't confronted at town halls, don't have to stare down people who are saying, hey, why did you send my brother overseas? Hey, why did you raise my taxes so you could fund nation building in Northern Africa where we don't have any interest whatsoever? This is a huge development. And that's not to say that we aren't still losing men in the Middle East. We absolutely are. Men and women in the Middle East, we absolutely are. That's not to say that eventually these fiscal consequences aren't going to catch up with us. But right now, it's mostly unfelt. And I think that doesn't give Congress much of a motivation. Congress is motivated primarily by getting reelected, and that doesn't give them much of a motivation in order to take back those powers. So I think we need to work on it. We need to elect more people like Cynthia Lummis in Wyoming, like Nancy Mace in South Carolina. That was a big victory for realists and restrainers. I'm thrilled that she won there. Of course, we've got to keep Rand Paul in there. Maybe we can create the right set of oily incentives to lure Ted Cruz back into our side. I'm not too optimistic about that one, but you never know, whichever way the wind blows. We need good people. We need people who agree with what we believe in because, just one last point, I want to echo what was said before about Biden not being particularly impassioned. If you are going to change our foreign policy, it isn't just a set of policy changes, right? It isn't just you go in and flip a few switches. You are taking on the military-industrial complex. You're going up against a very entrenched system that makes a lot of money for a lot of people that's been there for a long time. You are going against what the overwhelming majority of the advisor class in D.C. Thinks that we ought to do. That's another thing we have to do. That's why institutions like the Quincy Institute are so important. We have to change that advisor class and make it, have our own people who can go in there. You're really, and you're taking on what a majority of Congress wants too. So it is a real haul, and I think especially moving back to the executive level now, we're not going to see the kind of change we want until we have somebody who goes in and is really committed to it, right? It's probably going to take a Rand Paul more so than a Donald Trump. It can't just be incidental. It can't be, I happen to believe in realism and restraint. That has to be a motivating cause, and you have to be willing to, pay the price and take on powerful forces, I think.
I'm a little more optimistic about Congress being more assertive in foreign policy. I don't think that it's guaranteed that they'll be consistently doing the right things. Rachel, you've written a lot, I know, about Congress not fulfilling some of its basic duties and not really stepping up to the plate and actually enjoying delegating a lot of authority to the executive branch because they're not held accountable for bad things that happen. I mentioned the 2002 AUMF vote. I think that the reason why for a long time Congress avoided doing things like using the War Powers Act and pushing forward and trying to repeal the 2001 AUMF or voting on a new AUMF for something like Syria is because they saw politicians like Hillary Clinton be held accountable for their votes. I actually think that's a good thing that they saw the bad political incentives for supporting bad wars, but the effect of that was for leadership in the House and the Senate to say, well, we're just going to cop out and not vote on this stuff anymore. But that slowly started to change over the past few years. You've seen some really interesting bipartisan coalitions come together. You have people like Mike Lee joining forces with Bernie Sanders, people like Matt Gaetz joining forces with Ro Khanna. You've seen a interesting synergy between the Freedom Caucus and the House Progressive Caucus on things like Gaetz-Khanna, which was the amendment that Congressman Gaetz and Congressman Khanna put forward to prevent the executive branch from using existing authorizations to go to war with Iran. And so you've seen more progress over the past few years. I think the big question is will the left side of that coalition hold up under a Biden administration? And while I think Biden and people around him have paid lip service to doing stuff like repealing the 2001 AUMF, which authorized operations in Afghanistan initially, but which has been used and abused to authorize, conflict in places like Libya and Somalia, and also the 2002 AUMF. I think there will be a hesitancy, just like you saw under Obama, to really tackle those on. And will the left side of the coalition really hold firm? I think somebody like a Congressman Ro Khanna, somebody like a Congressman Barbara Lee, absolutely they will stand firm on that. But I'm worried about some of the more centrist Democrats. But I think that the role that groups like Concerned Veterans for America can play in that, along with some of our partners on the left, like Vote Vets, Common Defense, Win Without War, is we can create those political incentives on the ground by generating phone calls in offices, doing grassroots activities so that you're having a dynamic where Congressman's office, Congresswoman's office are getting overwhelmed by calls and emails of people who do believe we need to pursue a more restrained foreign policy and who believe Congress needs to step up and do its job. And we have been able to successfully do that. Again, I think Gaetz-Khanna is a great example of that. The 2002 AUMF vote earlier this year is another example. So I'm a little more hopeful, but I do think it is appropriate to not be totally optimistic and to worry that this coalition that's developed the last few years isn't that durable under the current political environment.
So they gave nice full answers. I'll keep mine brief. I think the Founding Fathers got the incentive structure on the legislature and executive branch a little wrong, unfortunately. They do not jealously guard their powers. They're eager to allow the executive branch to usurp them under certain conditions, as we've talked about. And I have a similar answer here to my previous one, which is that big changes are probably not going to come unless from a determined effort to do a specific set of things. And Congress clawing back its full war powers authority, I'm not that optimistic about. But what I'm a little bit more optimistic about, given the nature of politics right now, the nature of foreign policy in those politics, and some of the stuff that Dan was talking about, I think there is a possibility to push for more limited congressional muscle in the realm of oversight, for example. Especially if there's a split in terms of the Republicans maintaining the Senate. There are some incentives there after the chaos of the Nixon years and so on. You had the Church Committee and you had all these reform efforts led to the War Powers Resolution and more FISA and so on. So that kind of thing I think is not impossible, provided there's some political momentum for it. But in terms of major changes and Congress really stepping into its full constitutional role on foreign policy, I'm doubtful.
John, can I actually ask you to expand on that a little bit, the role of congressional oversight, because you're right, it is in sort of an untapped role Congress has. Can you expand a little bit on what specifically areas you think might be worthy of oversight in kind of the foreign policy space as it's being executed?
Sure. Well, one is certainly the drone war and the global war on terror. So the executive branch is not super honest about these kinds of things, but from what we can gather, we're currently engaged in active hostilities in somewhere between 7 and 14 countries. Most Americans have no idea about this. And so Congress, I think, should do everything in its power to publicize our current military activities, where we're currently in conflict, and display for the American people what we're actually up to so that they can make informed decisions. That's at least one area.
Thanks. So we've talked a little bit about kind of the foreshadowing of what a Biden foreign policy might look like. I want to take a minute to talk about what we would expect from it if Trump has a second term, where we would expect him to focus, what the challenges will be, because the first term has actually been, he's had a robust foreign policy on a number of issues. So if we can just go down the line and give me your sort of prognostication for a second Trump term, where the foreign policy emphasis will be. And then I want to take the remaining time to talk about some personnel challenges.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say. I'll just comment on, I think, a couple areas in the world. I think he'll probably keep the troops coming out of Afghanistan and Germany. Afghanistan has been one of the areas where President Trump has been very strong, to the point of really standing up and challenging his advisors, even getting angry at them in meetings, saying, hey, why are they still there? This is a campaign promise I made. I think he'll continue that to be a promise going forward, and the troops will continue to come out. I'll just say one more thing. I'm very interested to see what he does with Azerbaijan and Armenia, because right now he's mostly taken a hands-off approach. I think largely because, well, first of all, I don't think he considers it his fight to a certain extent, but also because he's very focused on the election. And I'm curious to see, once that distraction is no longer there, once he gets his head back into policy a little bit and is doing more briefings and so on, whether or not he tries to take a more active role, or whether he says, you know what, that's in a different part of the world, Russia's handling it, it's not in our sphere of influence, we're going to leave it alone. I don't want to call that a bellwether for how a Trump second term will look on foreign policy, but I am very curious about it. And then one more thing I'll add is that right now the European Union is entertaining the notion of going back into Libya for some degree of another intervention. We're not sure how much military would be involved or what exactly they're planning to do, but the idea has been raised. And obviously they're not going to attempt that without the United States' involvement. So whether they try to lean on Trump, whether Trump says yes or whether he says no, whether he, any indication of whether he'll help out there at all, I think these are all things that we should watch going forward.
Matt hit on a lot of good points. I agree that under a Trump second term, I do think that we would likely get to zero in Afghanistan. I think he's very passionate about that. There's actually an interesting article, I believe in the New York Times, that Billy Graham's grandson, who was an Army Ranger that had served in Afghanistan, at Billy Graham's funeral, talked to Trump and say, hey, you gotta keep your promise and end this war, and that played a key role in that. And I think that's actually something else that the president deserves credit for, is that he's more inclined to listen to lower level officers and enlisted and mid-level officers as opposed to his generals, who've been consistently wrong about these conflicts, and that has driven a lot of his thinking around getting out of these wars. Because, as we've alluded to before, and as you can see in a lot of polling that Concerned Veterans for America has done, the veteran community and military community is turning overwhelmingly, I'm talking 70% plus, against our current endless wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and generally want us to pursue a more restrained foreign policy. I think there's opportunity around Afghanistan. I think that the conditions in Iraq create an opportunity for him to go to zero in Iraq, and the same with Syria. However, the asterisk I'd put on that is around the Iran policy, which is what I would be most worried about in a second Trump term, particularly if he decides to continue maximum pressure, if he keeps getting pushed by his advisors to pursue bad policies around Iran. That would probably create an argument and an opening for people to convince him to keep troops in Iraq and Syria. I am a little more optimistic, I think, than some, though, that he will start to move the right way on Iran. If you look at a lot of his remarks, he leaves the door open for a deal, a better deal. It might sound a little silly to some and that it's not serious, but I think it shows that he has an inclination to try and solve these problems through diplomacy, through deal making, as opposed to war. He likes, going and trying to be the peacemaker in Korea. He likes a lot of these peace deals that he's pursuing and helping implement with Israel and some of these Arab countries, which I know there's some divide in the realism and restraint movement about whether those are good or bad for us, but still, it shows a more positive inclination towards deal making and diplomacy. I also think that there's a lot of opportunities in a Trump second term to challenge our consensus around alliances in NATO. Would like to see more things like pulling out of Germany, but not sending troops to Poland. I think that Trump would not expand NATO to places like Ukraine or Georgia, or even now they're talking about possibly trying to talk Serbia into joining NATO, which I think would be the first country that NATO has bombed that then joins it. But I think that's a real risk under a Biden administration. So there's I think some opportunities in addition to continuing to reshape foreign policy on the right. But I will admit, there are some challenges, and I'd say again that it's particularly around Iran, and then also possibly China as well too. I think that we could do some problematic things in regards to China. But again, going back to that deal-making inclination, I'm not totally convinced that he'll go the wrong way there.
This might be a minority view here, but I think the Trump administration's commitment to foreign policy restraint has been mildly exaggerated, let's say. It is a part of his sloganeering, and in some cases we can point to unique occurrences in the making of U.S. foreign policy, at least recently, like a push to withdraw some of our permanent garrison in Germany, and a lot of chatter about withdrawing from wars, but doing so 0 times. A lot of chatter about withdrawing from Syria, still hasn't done that, where they're protecting oil. Withdraw from Afghanistan, big campaign promise, certainly something he talks about constantly. This is actually, I have a lot of criticism of this administration's foreign policy, but on Afghanistan, I actually have some amount of praise because it's the one area where Trump has agreed to kind of stay out. He's empowered his ambassador, Zalmay Khalilzad, with broad leeway to engage in negotiations and get us out of that country. But it's actually not super hard to pull troops out of a country. You can do it just like that if you're president. And Obama had pressure from his generals and his national security team to surge in Afghanistan. He then went and did it. It was still his fault. The buck stopped with him. And I have very little sympathy for Trump either. His adults in the room pushing him in an opposite direction, he picked them. And he can overrule his generals who don't want to withdraw from any ongoing war. They tend to be reluctant to get in new ones occasionally. But Trump's foreign policy has been very activist, very interventionist, very belligerent, and in some cases, non-intervention, something like, pulling out of the Paris Climate Accord or pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal, or ruining friendly relations with much of Europe. We have pretty poor relations with them right now. Those things are sometimes viewed in the realist restraint camp as like pluses. This is kind of what we've been saying. We don't want to be Europe's security guarantor. They do free ride off of our treaty promises, etc. But we don't want a bad relationship with Europe. That's not in U.S. interests, right? Or going to North Korea. I think it's a wise thing for us to speak directly with the North Korean leadership to come to some sort of arrangement. Possibly that could result in some kind of political settlement between the two Koreas and possibly a withdrawal of U.S. troops from that peninsula. But he mismanaged the entire thing. Unlike Afghanistan, he decided to be at the center of it, and he cares more about the stagecraft than the statecraft of it, and so he bungled it completely. and no progress has been made. So, in general, I'm not optimistic about a second Trump term's commitment to restraint, especially because he'll be freed from any of the political pressures that he thinks his base voted him into office for. As he said, Afghanistan is one of his campaign promises.
So before we turn to sort of the personnel issue, which I do want to sort of wrap up the discussion with, I see a lot of Trump's term as dragging us out of sort of the liberal international order back into sort of great power politics, particularly around China, Iran, and Russia, and North Korea. And so if you consider those sort of fault lines for a future Biden administration, any of those countries, do you see a Biden administration changing dramatically Trump's approach to any of those countries?
List them again: North Korea,
China, Russia, North Korea, Iran.
North Korea and Iran. Not Iran, yes. I think there's a possibility that Biden might go back to the table because so much of our politics now is done around personality and done around kind of cultural maypoles. The Iran nuclear deal is considered untouchable by a big part of the left, and Biden, of course, supports it. So I could see him sitting down with the Iranians again. I think that would be a positive thing. I think that would be one of the, the few good things we might be able to expect out of a Biden administration. China, Biden has been talking tough on lately, I think because he's reading the political winds. I don't have much of a good idea about how he's going to react in office to that. I'm going to list that one as probably a question mark. Russia, it's tempting to say Biden would be tougher on Russia, except that Trump has actually been plenty tough on Russia. We pretend that somehow he's in league with Putin, but that's simply not the case. I mean, the United States has really, under his leadership, strengthened its back towards Russia in ways that haven't always been helpful, including the deployment of the troops, including expulsion of ambassadors and so on. So I'm not going to say he's going to be tougher. I think he'll probably take a stand against Putin and continue the policy, generally speaking, there. And then on North Korea, I can't imagine that Biden is going to approach Kim in the same way. I just have a difficult time fathoming that. I think that Trump genuinely wanted a deal with North Korea, and he was talked by his advisors into taking this maximalist position, denuclearization or something close to it before we're going to give any leeway. And of course, Kim said, no, that's off the table, and he walked away, and Trump walked away, and now. But I do think that that is a goal that Trump would genuinely like to achieve. I'm not sure that Biden is going to do the same thing. Then again, Bill Clinton tried. I mean, it's kind of it does make presidents look good if they at least attempt to bring North Korea, maybe not into the nation, what we would call the nation of families, but at least out of the wilderness, so to speak. So we can look for what might happen there. But yeah, I think that the biggest move that Biden is going to try to make, which gets back to what was said earlier, is going to European nations and saying, don't worry about what Trump said all those 4 years. None of that applies anymore. We want to take our seat at the table of democracies again, so to speak, and we want to lead you all. I think he's going to perhaps incidentally improve relationships with Europe a little bit. The problem is, as we were talking about before, Europe really is free riding off of us. That's not a Trumpian myth. That's actually true. Barack Obama said that one of his biggest regrets in office was not confronting the Europeans more. He did this expansive interview with The Atlantic where he just was fed up with it. I mean, was complaining about the fact that the Europeans rely on us for their defense while funding their lavish welfare states. This is a gripe that goes back administrations. And you need, I think, a certain amount of finesse in order to keep those alliances which are valuable and which we need, but also get them to step up and stop freeloading. There's a real kind of careful middle ground that you have to thread there, and Donald Trump is not a man known for his finesse, so he's probably not going to find it. But I also don't think that Biden probably will either. So,
I agree with a lot of what Matt said, and he hit on a lot of the points that I would say. Two things on Iran and then Russia. I do think that there is a lot of passion on the left about getting back into the Iran deal. I spoke to somebody who is more on the left and very close to a lot of people in Biden world, and there's already kind of an effort being brought together by people that helped implement the Iran deal under the Obama administration to get Biden to enter back into it. However, there are factions within the Biden coalition that do want to slow walk things with Iran. There was a Josh Rogan op-ed that it was written around a conversation he had with Chris Coons, and there was a line in there about how the current conditions with Iran as a result of maximum pressure make it difficult to get back into the JCPOA, and it's going to take a lot of political will for Biden to do that, and he's going to have to really use a lot of political capital to do that. So I don't think that it's going to be an easy path to improve things with Iran. And I also am kind of interested to see how much the Biden political people think they need to keep the Lincoln Project folks, the Republican voters against Trump, the hardcore neocons that supported Biden in their coalition. And are they going to feel like, okay, we're going to alienate them if we jump back into the Iran deal with both feet? So that's something that I'm honestly really unsure about. I think the Lincoln Project and some of these other groups kind of beclown themselves on election day. They didn't really have an impact. And I think that if anybody does an honest analysis of that, they'll see that. But they are very good at driving a narrative about themselves, and I can see them convincing people and Biden's political operation that they matter and you need to keep us happy, and the one way to keep us happy is on foreign policy. But again, there's no guarantee that's going to play out. I am extremely worried about Russia under a Biden administration, particularly on the issue of NATO expansion. Biden has been a longtime advocate of bringing in Ukraine to NATO. You can go back, and he was talking about this in the early days of the Obama administration, even while they were trying to, quote, reset things with Russia. So I think that would inflame tensions with Russia. It would incentivize Russia to do things that would be harmful to our national security. If he's going to keep troops in Syria and Iraq and Afghanistan, you could actually see for real now the Russians doing things like giving weapons to organizations in those countries that want to do us harm. I think the Russian bounty story from this summer turned out to be nonsense, but you could actually see them now doing something like that if we do go aggressively to expand NATO under Biden. So that's what I'm concerned about. I'm less confident really kind of commenting on North Korea and China. I haven't really been paying too much attention to what he's been saying there, but I do know around North Korea, he has criticized Trump's direct approach with the Kim regime, and I would be worried that they try to work through China on North Korea, and that's just been a failed approach for nearly 20, 30 years.
I'll try to be brief. Out of the things you mentioned, I think Europe, Iran, and Russia will be the biggest points of contrast. North Korea, my understanding is that at least in rhetoric, the Biden campaign has stated that they're open to direct negotiations, but they've set preconditions that are probably not going to be met. So that seems like a return to normal. With regard to China, I think that's a big open question. I haven't seen a lot from the Biden team or potential personnel that would suggest they really have a cohesive, coherent, and complete strategy to deal with China. There's some political pressure, maybe it was campaign, maybe it was just how he actually is, to be kind of hard line on China. And I think he will feel pressure to be hard line on trade. He'll feel pressure to be hard line on human rights. And I think he does sort of sense that this is a relationship that we have to cooperate. We have to make it a workable relationship, even if we find tensions or points where we need to push them. So I think that's a big question mark, and I'm not quite sure how it will play out beyond saying that in general, I think the approach of finger wagging and trying to ostentatiously make a kind of public example out of China in order to pressure it to our will is not a winning bet. We have to recognize the power that China has, while simultaneously recognizing the limits of our own power, our own ability to coerce and influence China on the things that we care about. It's pretty limited. And so I think we have to go into that relationship understanding that it will be reciprocal and involve compromise. It will involve some concessions on our side. And so this maximalist position where we're creeping towards containment, maintaining and even bolstering a military presence, in China's backyard, trying to engage in trade wars with them. This stuff is not conducive to cooperative working relationships by the two most geopolitically vital countries in the world. And so in general, I mean, that's my hope for the future of China policy, is that we take in those insights, but it doesn't appear that the Biden administration is prepared to.
So in our remaining few minutes, I want to talk about personnel, because personnel is policy in every area, but so much so in foreign policy, because as John inferred in the beginning, the blob, it churns, regardless of who's in charge. So I'm wondering if each of you can briefly just touch on, we talked a little bit about the Biden personnel, but if you can touch on a few of your hopes, I think, for Biden personnel choices and Trump personnel choices, and then we can leave it there.
Yeah, I mean, we've, and the others will be able to talk with more knowledge, I think, about Samantha Power and Susan Rice and Chris Murphy, perhaps, some of the names that will be brought into a Biden administration. I'll just limit myself to generally saying that I think that there are slightly more hawkish liberal candidates and slightly more dovish liberal candidates, right? If he brings in, I think, a Chris Murphy, then that's going to signal, wait a minute, really, maybe Biden is really leaning more towards the left, so to speak. Maybe he's leaning a little more dovish. If he brings in Samantha Power, then I think probably we can think the opposite. So a lot will depend on which way he swings in terms of these appointments. As for Donald Trump, look, I think that it's such a revolving door of personnel, and so many people have gone in and gone out, and so much of it is done at the president's impulse and what he sees on TV, who he happens to like. And just thinking about the things I could say on this, I would say just keep a couple things in mind. First of all, this president brought John Bolton into the administration. He didn't have to bring John Bolton into the administration, but he brought him in. He spat him out, basically fired him. He apparently made a joke to the Irish prime minister that John Bolton wanted to bomb Ireland when John Bolton was standing next to him, which is pretty funny. And he did eventually get rid of him, but not before Biden was able to suggest the Libya model as a potential paradigm for North Korea, an incredibly disruptive remark that really caused the North Koreans to bristle. That shows, I think, a president that is more committed to who is flattering him and who is praising him on TV, rather than bringing in somebody who is going to be really stiff-necked when it comes to realism and restraint. So I'm glad he's gone, but I think that we should just keep that in mind going forward. We're dealing with somebody who can be very desultory, very impetuous when it comes to naming personnel. And we could have ended up with a lot worse, I suppose, but I don't have a huge amount of confidence there. And the other thing I would say, too, is that Congress has not taken nearly enough power back for itself. And I don't have a huge amount of I know it's coming off as like the cynical bomb thrower during that question, but I don't have a huge amount of confidence in Congress. But nonetheless, we should look at who wields the power in Congress. And the most powerful Republican in the country right now, other than Donald Trump, is Mitch McConnell. And McConnell, think of the vast plethora of comments out of Trump's mouth, of things Trump has done that McConnell has overlooked or not commented on. And then Trump said, we want to pull some troops out of Syria. And McConnell said, okay, I'm going to war on this one. We're not letting this happen. And introduced a resolution that would have condemned it, that would have said, no, we're not allowing this to happen. That shows you, I think, the mood of the congressional leadership, right? That shows you that there isn't exactly an appetite for much reform there. Does anybody have any confidence that if Republicans eventually take back the House, Kevin McCarthy is going to be some great reformer on foreign policy? Probably not. I'd say that's a pipe dream. So you're kind of boxed in at the congressional level too. And again, it'll be interesting to see going forward. I like the pressure that Trump is applying on Afghanistan. I wish he would apply that in more realms, more departments of foreign policy. But it really has been a matter of going either way, I think.
I've already given a lot of my thoughts on Biden personnel, so I'm going to focus on Trump personnel. I think almost every foreign policy failure in the Trump administration tears up to personnel, and he's responsible for that. Blaming it on personnel is not an attempt to excuse him. As John's pointed out, as Matt's pointed out, he allowed those people to enter his administration. However, you have seen a change at the White House in regards to how they vet and appoint personnel. I think the new head of PPO is very much in tune to the type of people that are needed to implement Trump's stated vision for foreign policy. So you've seen the nomination of people like Will Ruger to be the ambassador to Afghanistan. For disclosure, I work with Will, and he's a friend. I know a lot of people on the stage and in the room know Will. You've seen the nomination of Doug McGregor to the role of ambassador to Germany. You've seen some better people start to enter State Department and NSC. And I think that you'll see an improvement in the quality of personnel in Trump's second term. Now, it's not guaranteed that every appointment will be good. Matt is absolutely right. There's a tendency sometimes for Trump to see somebody on TV like John Bolton, maybe somebody like Tom Cotton, and say, hey, I want that person as my Secretary of Defense. But the same thing plays out. They maybe last for 6 months or a year, and then Trump realizes this person doesn't agree with them, and he undermines them, he has to fire him. So that is still a risk that could happen, but I am more hopeful because the key office of presidential personnel is getting better at vetting and nominating foreign policy and national security staff. So I think you'll see better personnel overall in a Trump term, but just like everything, it's not guaranteed.
Well, I think Donald Trump was a good test case for the likelihood that a political outsider like he was, who stated things during the campaign that were deeply at odds with the political consensus on U.S. foreign policy, that whether or not that kind of candidate could bring in personnel that would be different from the status quo and try to carry out some changes, and we know the story there. Joe Biden is a establishmentarian to a T, and I don't think we should expect him to be bringing in anyone other than other establishmentarians with a generalized, though perhaps tilting dovish, agreement on U.S. foreign policy that we should be the number one foam finger and get in everyone's business. So I think that's likely to continue no matter what.
All right, well, we'll leave it there. Guys, thank you so much. Matt, Dan, John, appreciate you guys, and thank you.
Thank you.